Beneath the polished surface, Ethan Grayson stood at the corner of Maple Avenue, staring at the small glass-fronted cafe that bore his company's familiar green and gold logo. The sign above the door read Grayson Grounds, the same name that had once been scrawled on a napkin when he was 23, fueled by dreams and coffee beans. Back then, he had imagined a chain of cozy coffee shops where customers lingered, employees smiled, and community thrived. Now, at 51, Ethan owned 86 locations across 4 states. His face graced magazine covers for entrepreneurship awards. And his story, from broke college dropout to coffee mogul, was the stuff of viral LinkedIn posts. Investors loved him. Customers seemed happy. Yet, something was off. And that's why he stood there, in a thrift store jacket and worn sneakers, watching the place he had built from scratch. It started with an anonymous letter. The letter arrived 2 months earlier, typed on plain paper with no return address. It wasn't angry or threatening. It was desperate. The anonymous writer, an employee from one of his stores, detailed missed paychecks, shifts extended without warning, and a store manager who threatened to dock hours if anyone spoke up. It ended with a single, haunting line: "I can't even afford to eat." Ethan had always prided himself on fair wages. When he started, Grayson Grounds paid a full $1 above minimum wage. He offered benefits long before it was fashionable for small businesses. Yet, somewhere along the line, something had slipped. The company had grown faster than Ethan could control, and he had handed over too much authority to district managers and corporate policies. His executive team brushed off the letter. "Probably a disgruntled employee," they said. "We pay market rate." But Ethan couldn't shake it. He spent a week reviewing financials, and on paper, the wages were competitive. Benefits were offered, though fewer employees seemed to use them. Reports from regional managers showed nothing alarming. Turnover was slightly up, but the industry average was higher. Everything looked normal. But normal didn't write anonymous letters begging for food. Ethan made a decision. If the numbers couldn't show him the truth, the people would. The disguise and the plan. A few days later, Ethan stood outside store number 47, a location far enough from headquarters that no one would recognize him. His hair was dyed a dull gray, his beard trimmed to stubble. Thick-rimmed glasses covered his face, and the thrift store jacket completed the look of a middle-aged man down on his luck. He carried no phone, no wallet with corporate cards, just $40 in cash and the name Ethan Parks. He pushed the door open, the small chime greeting him with the warm, familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee. It should have been comforting, but something felt wrong. The place was clean, but not welcoming. The decor, once chosen to feel homey and personal, now felt cold and corporate. Employees moved with mechanical precision, smiles stretched thin and fragile. It was a performance, one rehearsed for customers, but dropped the moment backs were turned. Ethan approached the counter, glancing at the menu even though he had memorized it years ago. A young woman stood at the register. Her name tag read Maya, and her forced smile faltered the second he hesitated. "Hi there, welcome to Grayson Grounds," she said, voice polite but distant. "What can I get started for you?" Ethan ordered a simple coffee and a breakfast sandwich. A test order, something every employee was trained to make in under 3 minutes. As Maya rang him up, she muttered under her breath, barely audible, "Wish I could afford one." The words hit him like a slap, but he kept his expression neutral. "Excuse me?" he asked, as if he hadn't quite heard. Maya's eyes flicked up, wide and startled. "Nothing. Just talking to myself," she said quickly. "Your total's $7.84. He handed over a crumpled $10 bill and watched as she counted back his change with trembling fingers. Ethan moved to a small table by the window, coffee untouched, hands clasped to keep from shaking. It wasn't just her words. It was the way her uniform hung off her, slightly too big, like she had lost weight. The way her shoulders curled inward, defensive and small. Ethan had hired a consultant years ago who said happy employees make happy customers, but Maya wasn't happy. And neither were the other workers. A shift manager, Travis according to his name tag, barked orders from the back, his voice loud enough to break the fragile silence. Maya, wipe down tables before the rush hits. Maya snapped to attention, abandoning her register duties to grab a rag and begin the robotic, circular wiping of surfaces already clean. Travis, meanwhile, leaned against the counter, phone in hand, barely glancing at her work. Layers of the problem. Ethan stayed for hours, blending in with the laptop crowd. No one questioned the quiet man in the corner with his refillable coffee cup and worn notebook. He took notes, real ones, not on spreadsheets, but on the way employees flinched when Travis raised his voice, the muted conversations between shifts where workers compared which bills they could skip this month. When Maya clocked out, Ethan followed her at a distance. She walked to the bus stop a block away, counting out change from her tip jar, just to make the fare. The sight made his stomach twist. A full-time employee at his company, reduced to scraping for bus fare. Back in his hotel room that night, Ethan stared at his reflection in the mirror. The CEO looking back at him was a stranger, someone who had let his dream warp into something unrecognizable, a machine, optimized for profit, but blind to the human cost. Day 2. On the inside. The next morning, Ethan didn't walk in as a customer. He walked in as Ethan Parks, the new hire. His fake resume, crafted with the help of an old college friend, claimed he'd spent years bouncing between retail jobs, nothing impressive enough to draw attention. Travis conducted the interview at a back table, barely looking up from his phone. "You work food service before?" he grunted. "Some," Ethan said. "Cool. Minimum wage. You start tomorrow." That was it. No questions about availability, no explanations about company culture, not even a welcome packet. Just a time slot and a warning not to be late. Day 1 was chaos. There was no training, no orientation. Another employee, a teenage boy named Marcus who had been working for 3 weeks, was told to show him the ropes. Marcus, to his credit, tried. But he barely knew the ropes himself. Just press this for regular coffee. This for lattes. If someone asks for oat milk, it's in the back, I think. Ethan's first hour was a blur of wrong orders, apologies, and watching Maya juggle her tasks with the efficiency of someone used to picking up everyone else's slack. Travis hovered, never helping, only criticizing. By lunch, Ethan had learned 2 things. Mistakes were inevitable because training was non-existent. Every mistake was blamed on the employees, loudly and in front of customers. At one point, Maya accidentally grabbed the wrong syrup for a drink. The customer complained, and Travis stormed to the counter. "That's coming out of your paycheck," he snarled. Maya's face paled. "But it's just. No excuses. Pay attention." The customer, embarrassed, offered to pay for both drinks, but Travis waved her off. Company policy. It wasn't. Ethan knew that, but no one else did. That night, Ethan sat in his hotel room, stomach churning. It wasn't a single bad manager. It was a system that bred fear and silence, a system he had allowed to grow because he'd stepped too far back. The anonymous letter wasn't an exaggeration. If anything, it had been too polite. He had seen enough. Tomorrow, Ethan Grayson wouldn't walk in as Ethan Parks. Tomorrow, the CEO was coming in. And this time, there'd be no disguises. Breaking the silence. The sun had barely risen when Ethan stood outside Grayson Graham's store number 47 for the second time that week. But this time, there was no disguise. No thrift store jacket, no fake glasses, no blending into the background. Today, he wore the uniform of power, a tailored navy blazer, crisp white shirt, and the sleek watch he'd received after Grayson Grounds hit its 50th location milestone. He was no longer Ethan Parks. He was Ethan Grayson, the founder, the CEO, the man whose framed portrait hung in corporate break rooms across the company. The man whose name employees grumbled about during brutal shifts, unaware the flesh and blood version stood right beside them just a day earlier. The store door chimed as he stepped inside. The air was the same, heavy with roasted beans, syrup, and something subtler. Tension. Employees moved with robotic precision, lips pressed into polite smiles that faded as soon as backs were turned. Ethan saw Maya at the register, fingers moving quickly over the touchscreen. Her smile was brittle, her eyes dull, and her shoulders hunched slightly inward, bracing herself for the next rush, the next mistake, the next reprimand. She didn't recognize him. Not yet. Then Travis walked out from the back, clipboard in hand, coffee in the other, and stopped mid-step when his eyes locked onto Ethan's. Confusion flickered first, then recognition, then fear. "Mr. Grayson," Travis stammered, straightening his posture so fast it looked painful. What brings you here?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch just long enough for Maya to glance up from the register. Her eyes widened slightly, lips parting in silent shock. "I thought I'd visit one of my stores," Ethan said at last, voice calm but edged in iron. "I like to see how things are running with my own eyes." Travis swallowed hard. "Of course. We're always happy to see upper management." His fake smile was blinding, too wide, the kind of smile Ethan had learned to distrust years ago. "Good," Ethan said softly, "because I'm not just visiting. I'm here to work." Travis's smile faltered. "Work? I spent the last 2 days working here under a different name," Ethan said, voice just loud enough to carry to the employees near the counter. "Ethan Parks." Maya's hand froze on the register. Marcus, the teenage trainee, nearly dropped the milk pitcher he was holding. The silence deepened, punctuated only by the hiss of the steamer wand. You worked here." Travis's voice cracked on the last word. "I did," Ethan said, "and what I saw was unacceptable." The store remained frozen. Every employee was locked in place, watching the scene unfold with the kind of intensity usually reserved for car crashes and courtroom dramas. Ethan turned slowly, addressing not just Travis, but the whole team. "I saw employees working back-to-back shifts without proper breaks," Ethan said. "I saw mistakes punished instead of used as learning opportunities. I saw paychecks that didn't match hours worked. And I saw a culture of fear." He let that last word hang in the air, heavy and cold. Travis's mouth opened, then closed. His face flushed red, then pale. "Sir, I can explain." "I doubt it," Ethan said simply. Before Travis could protest, Ethan turned to Maya. "Maya," he said softly, "how much do you have in your bank account right now?" She flinched at the directness of the question. Her eyes darted to Travis, then back to Ethan. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. Less than $30, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded once. Then he turned to the other employees. "If you've ever been shorted on your paycheck, even once, raise your hand." Maya's hand went up first, then Marcus, then 3 more hands, almost every employee in the room. Travis's face turned the color of week-old coffee cream. That's payroll. I don't control that." Ethan's gaze pinned him like a specimen under glass. "Payroll follows the hours you submit," Ethan said. "Hours you control." Travis floundered. "Sometimes there are discrepancies." "Discrepancies," Ethan repeated, voice flat. "Or theft." Travis's mouth snapped shut. Ethan took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. "You docked Maya's pay for a mistake that cost less than $1. You threatened to cut hours if anyone complained. You've created an environment where my employees, my people, are afraid to speak." Travis's shoulders squared, but there was no fight left in his eyes. "I was just following the policies we were given," he muttered weakly. Ethan's jaw clenched. "I wrote those policies, and nowhere in them does it say to exploit your team. Travis opened his mouth again, but Ethan held up a hand. You're done here. Wait. Travis's voice cracked with panic. You can't. I can. Ethan said, his voice low but undeniable. Clean out your locker. You're terminated. Effective immediately. Travis stood frozen for a moment, disbelief flickering across his face. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the back. The door swung shut behind him, leaving only the stunned silence of employees too shocked to process what they'd just witnessed. Ethan turned back to Maya and the others. I'm sorry, he said, voice softer now. I let this happen. I trusted reports and numbers instead of trusting my people. That changes today. Maya's brow furrowed. You really worked here? As Ethan Parks. I did, Ethan said. And what I saw was enough to break my heart. Marcus's hand shot up. Does this mean we can actually talk to you? Like about stuff? Ethan smiled faintly. Yes. Starting today, my office door is open. To all of you. Maya crossed her arms, expression skeptical. You say that now. But what happens when you leave? Another Travis shows up, and we're back where we started. You're right to be cautious, Ethan said. Words aren't enough. Actions matter. He paused, glancing around the room. So here's what's happening. First, every single employee will receive back pay for any hours shorted over the last 6 months. Maya's eyes widened. Seriously, Ethan said. Second, base wages are going up across the board. Not just here, but company-wide. Marcus let out a low whistle. No way. Ethan said. Third, we're hiring. You shouldn't have to run a full shift with half the people you meet. Maya's expression softened, but doubt lingered. It sounds good, but promises don't pay rent. Ethan met her gaze. That's why I'm staying, he said. Not just for today. For as long as it takes to rebuild this place. And the trust I lost. The employees exchanged glances, silent conversations passing between them. Hope was a fragile thing in a place like this. Easily promised, rarely delivered. Maya was the first to step forward. If you're serious, if you actually follow through, we'll back you up. But if this is just for show, it's not, Ethan said firmly. This is personal. She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. Okay. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was only the first store, one of 86. But if he could fix this one, maybe, just maybe, he could fix them all. Let's get to work, Ethan said. For the first time that day, Maya smiled. Not a customer service smile, but a real one. And as Ethan rolled up his sleeves and stepped behind the counter, the weight on his chest felt just a little lighter. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, Ethan was walking it with his people, not above them. And that made all the difference. The rot beneath the roots. Ethan Grayson stood in his corner office, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a pristine view of downtown, a view he had barely noticed in years. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, a polished executive in a tailored suit, but all he could see was the face of the man who had spent 16 hours washing counters and running coffee orders under the name Ethan Parks. The memory of Maya's trembling hands, Travis's barked orders, and the whispered complaints of his frontline workers rang louder than any quarterly report or investor call ever had. Grayson Grounds wasn't broken because of one bad manager in one unlucky store. There was rot in the roots, and it was his name on the sign. He had two options: patch the problem with cosmetic fixes, like so many CEOs before him, or rip up the entire system and face whatever ugliness lay beneath. Ethan had always prided himself on choosing the harder road. Today would be no different. Step 1. The Purge. The first email went out at 9:00 a.m. Subject line: Immediate store-level audit and management review. It was short and clinical, but every regional manager, district manager, and store supervisor would feel the tremor beneath the corporate speak. Ethan wasn't asking for self-reports. He was launching unscheduled visits to every store, and he wasn't coming alone. The second email, more personal, went out to every Grayson Grounds employee. Not managers, employees. It came directly from his address. To every member of the Grayson Grounds team. I've seen firsthand that our stores, our people, and our values have drifted from what we once stood for. That's my fault, and I'm not hiding from it. Starting immediately, I'm visiting every location in person, unannounced, to hear directly from you. If you've been mistreated, underpaid, or ignored, I want to know. No retaliation will be tolerated. Your voices will shape what comes next. We built this company together. Now we'll rebuild it the right way. Ethan Grayson, CEO, Grayson Grounds. The replies began flooding in within an hour. Some were cautious, some angry. Many were raw. Employees shocked to hear from a man they assumed lived in a marble office, not the real world. Ethan read every single one, feeling the weight grow heavier with each message. My manager changes our timesheets after we clock out. I haven't had a proper day off in 3 weeks. I'm a single mom, and I had to bring my kid to work because my shift was changed last minute. They told us complaining would get us blacklisted. Ethan's stomach churned. The rot was deeper than he feared. Step 2. The first confrontation. The first store on his list was store number 12, one of the oldest locations, run by a manager named Carla Haynes. Carla had been with Grayson Grounds since the beginning, the kind of manager corporate praised for driving results and enforcing standards. Ethan walked in unannounced, no warning, no ceremony. The chime above the door barely rang before Carla spotted him, clipboard clutched in her hands. Her smile was forced, bright with tension. "Mr. Grayson." "What a surprise," she said, a little too loud. Employees shot glances from behind the espresso bar, clearly startled. "Morning, Carla," Ethan said, voice calm. "Can we talk?" "Absolutely." She gestured toward the tiny back office, but Ethan shook his head. "No," he said. "Right here." Carla's smile froze. "Right here. In front of everyone," Ethan said firmly. "Transparency, right?" The employees, a mix of veterans and new hires, went still. The store wasn't busy yet, but the silence felt heavier than the industrial espresso machine. Ethan turned to them. "Before we start, I have a question for the team," he said. "How many of you have had your schedules changed at the last minute with no warning?" Hands went up, one by one. A barista near the pastry case raised hers slowly, almost afraid to be seen. Ethan nodded. "How many of you have been told that mistakes come out of your paycheck?" A few more hands. Carla's expression tightened, but she said nothing. "And how many of you feel comfortable reporting problems to management?" Ethan's voice softened. Not a single hand. Carla's face reddened. "With all due respect, Mr. Grayson, this feels like accountability," Ethan said smoothly. "It should." He turned to face her fully. "Carla, I read the store reports you submit. They say everything's running smoothly. They say your team is happy." "They are," Carla said quickly, voice too bright. Ethan's brow arched. "Then why do their stories not match yours?" Carla's mouth opened, but no words came. "This isn't just about numbers," Ethan continued, his voice steady but with rising force. "It's about culture. It's about leadership, and leadership starts at the top. With me, yes, but also with you." Carla's hands clenched the clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I've done what corporate asked me to do." "No," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "You did what was easiest to look good to corporate. There's a difference." The employees watched, wide-eyed, as their once untouchable manager stood under direct scrutiny. For the first time, they weren't the ones being questioned. "This store will change," Ethan said, addressing everyone. "Starting now, no more last-minute schedules, no more wage docking, No more retaliation, and no more silence. He turned back to Carla. If you can lead that change, you'll stay. If you can't, you won't. Carla's face paled. You're saying, I'm saying your job depends on whether you're part of the solution or the problem. Step 3. Real voices, real stories. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan visited 24 stores. He sat in break rooms with peeling paint, listened to cashiers who hadn't had a raise in 4 years, and managers who were too afraid of corporate quotas to push back on toxic policies. He heard stories of favoritism, of sexual harassment swept under the rug, of pregnant employees denied breaks because the line is too long. Some stores had bright spots, managers who protected their teams, supervisors who bought coffee out of their own pocket when the company cost-controlled the supply budget. But they were rare. For every one of them, there were 5 Trevises. One story stuck with Ethan the most. In a suburban location outside Chicago, a young woman named Linda told him how her manager had refused to approve her time-off request to visit her dying father. She had been forced to quit just to say goodbye. Ethan sat in his rental car after that visit, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they shook. This was his company, his name on the aprons, his signature on every corporate memo. And his silence had let this happen. Step 4. Building a new foundation. The final piece came together in Ethan's mind on the flight home. Policies could be rewritten, wages raised, and managers fired. But none of that would fix the deeper disease. The disease was distance. The disease was a CEO who stopped listening. So Ethan made a promise, not just to himself, but to every employee he met. Every month, for as long as he was CEO, he would work 1 shift at a random Grayson Grounds location. No fanfare, no cameras, just Ethan, an apron, and the people who made his company run. When he announced it at the next all-company call, the reaction was silence, then applause, then cautious hope. Actions would matter more than words. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't just the CEO. He was one of them. And that was how you rebuild a company. Resistance from the top. Ethan Grayson sat at the head of the massive oak conference table in Grayson Grounds corporate headquarters. But for the first time in years, he felt like a stranger in his own boardroom. The executive leadership team, 12 of them, lined the sides, polished and professional, every one of them hired during the company's rapid expansion. Their resumes were pristine, their track records full of metrics, profits, and shareholder appeasement. Not a single one of them had ever worked a shift behind the counter. None of them knew what it felt like to pull a double shift while calculating whether they could afford rent or dinner that week. And they were pissed. Ethan's email, his personal employee outreach, and the unannounced store visits had reached their ears, but not from him. They heard it from district managers panicking about audits and regional directors scrambling to explain why stores that had looked fine on paper were full of rot in reality. The chief operating officer, Darren Kent, folded his hands neatly on the table. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly combed, his tie a fraction too tight, and his expression the perfect corporate mask of polite disagreement. Ethan, Darren began, voice calm, we need to discuss the scope of these pop-up visits. Ethan didn't reply right away. He let the silence stretch, meeting every executive's gaze in turn. He wanted to see how uncomfortable they were, how many of them shifted, how many avoided his eyes, how many squared their shoulders like they were ready for battle. Most avoided him. A few, Darren included, met his gaze head-on. I'm not discussing it, Ethan said at last, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. I'm informing you. These visits are happening. Not just this month. Every month. For as long as I'm CEO. A murmur swept through the room. Some whispers, some incredulous chuckles. Kristen Myers, the chief financial officer, leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping a rhythm on her notepad. Ethan, she said, using that tone reserved for unreasonable children. Let's be practical. Our job is to protect the company's profitability and stability. surprise inspections, and direct employee access to the CEO. That creates chaos. It undermines middle management, disrupts operations, and creates risk. Ethan's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice even. What creates risk is what's already happening in those stores. Wage theft, retaliation, illegal labor practices. If we don't clean house, that's what'll disrupt operations when we get slapped with lawsuits or wind up in the headlines for labor violations. Darren shifted, exhaling through his nose. Those are isolated incidents. No, they're not. Ethan reached into the worn leather folder on the table beside him, the same folder he'd carried to every store visit, and pulled out a stack of printed emails. These are the stories from employees, dozens of them, from stores across every region. He slid them down the table. Executives leaned forward, reading the stark black text, each story a fresh gut punch. I've been shorted hours 5 times in 2 months. My manager says payroll is just slow. I was told I had to work while I was sick, or I'd lose my hours next week. I cried in the stockroom after being yelled at for taking a legally required break. I'm a shift lead, but I still make less than $13 an hour after 3 years. Kristen's mouth tightened into a thin line. We can't let anecdotal experiences dictate corporate policy. Ethan's hand slammed onto the table, making the water glasses jump. They're not anecdotes. They're people. Our people. And if you think their survival is just a footnote to our profits, you can clean out your desk. The room went still. Darren leaned back, his face unreadable. You're serious about this? Dead serious, Ethan said. The cost of ethics. That afternoon, Ethan sat in his office, looking down at the street below. The usual afternoon rush poured into the downtown Grayson Grounds location across from corporate headquarters, customers streaming in for cold brews, lattes, and quick conversations. He wondered how many of them knew what it took to keep that store running. How many were served by baristas wondering if they could afford their own dinner. How many smiles were faked. There was a knock at the door. His assistant, Marcy, poked her head in. Legal's here. Ethan's stomach tensed. Send them in. Samantha Cho, general counsel, walked in with a leather folder of her own. She was younger than most of the leadership team, but twice as sharp, known for her no-nonsense approach and ability to sniff out risk like a bloodhound. We need to talk about the wage increases, she said without preamble. Ethan gestured for her to sit. What about them? District managers are already complaining they can't meet labor budgets if you implement these raises across all locations. They're saying stores will dip into the red. Ethan exhaled slowly. We'll adjust. Samantha's brow arched. Adjust what? Prices? Corporate bonuses. You know where they're going to try and cut first. Labor hours, Ethan said quietly. Exactly, Samantha said. If they can't control wages, they'll cut shifts. Fewer people working, more pressure on those left, and suddenly we're back where we started. Ethan rubbed his temples. This was the real cost of ethics, not just paying people fairly, but breaking the entire system designed to extract every ounce of labor for as little money as possible. It wasn't a store-level problem. It was baked into the corporate DNA. I need you to write new labor policy, Ethan said. Lock it in. Minimum staffing levels for every shift. No retaliatory hour cuts. No unpaid overtime. And I want shift coverage bonuses. People who step up when we're short-staffed should be rewarded, not punished. Samantha whistled softly. That's gonna get expensive. Ethan's smile was grim. So are lawsuits. And so is losing every good employee we have. She nodded, scribbling notes. Okay, but you're gonna have to tell the investors. Ethan leaned back. I know. Facing the investors. The quarterly investor call was packed. Normally, Ethan dialed in from his office, but today he stood in front of a room full of faces. Shareholders, analysts, and private equity representatives, all waiting for assurances that Grayson Grounds would continue its upward climb. Ethan stood at the podium, the presentation deck flickering behind him. "We had a strong quarter," he began. "Revenue is up 4%, and comparable store sales increased across all regions." Murmured approval. "But," he continued, "there are fundamental problems inside this company. Problems I take responsibility for." The murmurs stopped. "For years we've driven expansion and efficiency at the cost of the very people who make this business possible," Ethan said. "We've ignored warning signs, low morale, high turnover, labor violations, because the numbers still looked good." A hand shot up. Greg Madsen, representing one of the largest private equity groups. "What exactly are you saying, Ethan?" "I'm saying we're going to pay people what they deserve," Ethan said. "We're going to invest in training, enforce labor laws, and create a culture where employees aren't afraid to speak." Madsen frowned. "That sounds expensive." "It is," Ethan said, "and it's necessary." "Won't that hurt margins?" Ethan's gaze swept the room. "Short term, maybe. Long term. Companies that exploit their workers always pay the price. In lawsuits, in turnover, in brand reputation. We're not going to be one of them." Silence. "Anyone who disagrees," Ethan said, "can sell their shares." It was a gamble. It could cost him his job. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't afraid of the fallout. Because Grayson Grounds wasn't just a brand. It was people. And this time, they came first. Revolt in the ranks. Ethan Grayson always thought the hardest battles were fought outside the walls, against competitors, shifting markets, and economic downturns. He had prepared for those wars, honed for them by decades of entrepreneurial struggle. What he never expected was that the fiercest rebellion would come from inside his own company. The first tremor hit the day after his investor call. His executive assistant, Marcy, walked into his office carrying a thick folder, her expression unreadable. "These are the formal letters of protest," she said, dropping the folder onto his desk with a muted thud. Ethan's brow furrowed. "Protest. From district managers," Marcy said, "and a few regional directors. They're calling your new policies unworkable. Some of them are threatening to resign if you push forward." Ethan opened the folder, leafing through printed emails and typed letters. The language varied. Some were cautiously worded warnings about budget strain. Others were outright accusations that Ethan had lost touch with operational reality. One letter, unsigned but clearly from someone high up the chain, stood out. "Mr. Grayson, these policies will destroy the flexibility managers need to run efficient stores. Higher wages and stricter scheduling policies will increase costs, reduce profit margins, and encourage laziness among staff who no longer fear accountability. If you continue down this path, you'll lose the very leaders who built your expansion. Consider this your warning." Ethan's grip tightened around the paper until the edges crumpled. He wasn't surprised. He'd expected pushback, but the sheer volume of resistance stunned him. These weren't just a handful of disgruntled managers. This was an organized revolt, fueled by the very culture he had allowed to fester. The emergency summit. By noon, Ethan had summoned every district manager and regional director to an emergency video call. There were over 50 faces on screen, some familiar, others anonymous boxes with initials. The mood was ice cold. "Let's not waste time," Ethan began, his voice low but firm. "I've read your letters. I understand your concerns, but this is not up for negotiation." Several boxes blinked to life, cameras activating as managers unmuted to speak over each other. "You're tying our hands. We can't hit performance targets with these wages. This is going to bankrupt smaller stores. You're rewarding mediocrity." Ethan let the shouting continue for a full 30 seconds before he raised his hand. "Enough." The silence fell hard. "I hear you," Ethan said, leaning closer to his camera. "But understand this. You are not owners of this company. You are stewards. You were trusted to run these stores, not to build fiefdoms where fear and wage theft pass for leadership." Several managers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "I worked in these stores. I saw the conditions you allowed to fester. Ethan's voice sharpened. Employees afraid to speak. Paychecks shorted. Workers held hostage to shifting schedules and impossible targets. That ends now. A regional director, a man named Todd Lambright, who had been with the company since its 5th location, unmuted. With all due respect, Ethan, you're overcorrecting. Every business has turnover. Every manager pushes their team. That's how you built this company. No, Todd, Ethan said coldly. I built this company by respecting the people behind the counter. And I forgot that. That's on me. But if you think I'm going to defend a system that chews up my employees and spits them out, you can clean out your desk. Todd's face reddened, but he didn't speak. This isn't optional, Ethan said, scanning the faces. I'm giving every district manager and regional director 1 week to decide if they can get on board with the new standards. Fair pay, predictable schedules, basic human decency. If you can't, resign. If you stay and violate these policies, you'll be fired. The silence was electric. Ethan could see the calculation flickering behind each face, some furious, some fearful, and a few relieved. This company is changing, Ethan said, his voice softer now. And if you can't change with it, you don't belong here. He ended the call without waiting for a response. The stories they never told him. That night, Ethan sat alone in his office, a bottle of scotch on the desk beside him. His inbox overflowed, managers quitting, others swearing loyalty, and a few, like Maya from store number 47, quietly offering words of hope. But one email stood out. The subject line read, "What you didn't see." The email was from a former employee, Alina Barlow, who had worked at Grayson Grounds for 6 years before quitting 2 months earlier. Mr. Grayson, I heard about what you're doing. I didn't think you'd care enough to fix it. I want you to know, the worst things never made it into reports. We were told to change time cards after payroll closed so labor costs looked better. Managers handed out under-the-table warnings if anyone complained about hours. One assistant manager made a girl cry in the stockroom, and when she called HR, her hours got cut until she quit. It wasn't just one bad apple. It was the whole orchard. I hope you really mean what you're saying now, because if you don't, nothing will change. Alina Barlow. Ethan read it twice, each word a fresh nail driven into the coffin of his own complacency. The worst things never made it into reports. He leaned back, the leather chair groaning beneath him. How many stories like Alina's were out there? How many workers had cried in stockrooms, quit in silence, or endured the quiet, soul-crushing grind of a system designed to squeeze them dry? He couldn't fix it all at once, but he could start. A new kind of leadership. The next morning, Ethan stood in front of store number 5, one of the oldest and busiest locations in the entire chain. No cameras, no press release, just him in jeans and a Grayson Grounds apron. The morning crew did a double take when they saw him. "Morning," Ethan said. "I'm here to work." The shift lead, a wiry woman named Angela, blinked at him. Like a shift. Like a shift, Ethan confirmed. He was rusty, but muscle memory kicked in after the first dozen orders. His latte art was atrocious, and he accidentally poured syrup into a black coffee, but Angela just laughed. Happens to the best of us. By midday, customers were starting to recognize him. Some whispered, others asked for selfies, but the employees, they saw something different. They saw a CEO who got his hands dirty, who scrubbed the counters, took out trash, and apologized when he fumbled an order. And for the first time in a long time, the workers at store number 5 smiled real smiles. At the end of the shift, Ethan gathered the team in the break room. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for every bad policy, every ignored complaint, and every time I put profits over you. No corporate jargon, no polished speech, just the truth. We're building something better," Ethan said. "Together." Angela raised a brow. "You're really gonna keep working shifts?" "Every month," Ethan said. "One store, every month. No warning. One of the newer hires grinned. Guess we better clean the stockroom. They laughed, not the nervous, rehearsed laughter Ethan had heard in so many stores, but something lighter, something real. It wasn't a victory. Not yet, but it was the first step. Revolutions start small. That night, Ethan got another email. This one from Alina. Heard you worked the floor today. Maybe you do mean it. I hope so. Ethan typed only 2 words in reply. I do. Then, for the first time in years, Ethan Grayson slept, not peacefully, but with the kind of exhaustion that came from finally doing the right thing. A legacy reclaimed. The early spring rain drummed softly against Ethan Grayson's office windows, a quiet rhythm that somehow mirrored the chaos inside his mind. The weeks since his undercover shift, and the storm it unleashed, had been the longest of his career. There were days he questioned if Grayson Grounds would survive the reckoning. But the reckoning had come regardless. He stood now, staring down at the sidewalk where employees streamed in and out of the downtown flagship store. He recognized a few faces, baristas who had been with the company since the early days, still hanging on. There was Maya from store number 47, walking toward the front door in a Grayson Grounds jacket, a manager's jacket. The sight brought a small smile to Ethan's face. But today was no day for nostalgia. He turned back toward the conference table in his office, where the board of directors sat, every seat filled. Some had flown in from out of state. Others had dialed in via the sleek video conferencing system. The air crackled with tension, the kind that only comes when money is about to be threatened. At the head of the table, Greg Madsen, the lead investor and chair of the board, leaned back in his seat, fingers steepled, a frown carved deep into his face. Ethan, Greg began, voice slow and deliberate. We've reviewed your proposed policies. Higher wages, guaranteed hours, employee grievance channels, monthly audits. It's ambitious. The word ambitious hung in the air like a curse. It's necessary, Ethan replied, voice calm but unyielding. Greg's eyes narrowed. And expensive. Yes, Ethan agreed. Good things usually are. A murmur rippled through the room. Some in agreement, others in frustration. Ethan let it settle before continuing. Let me be clear about something, Ethan said, pacing slowly along the length of the table. This company was never meant to be a machine that chews up its workers and spits them out for a slightly higher quarterly margin. Greg's brow arched. We are, and have always been, a business, Ethan. We are, Ethan acknowledged. But business doesn't have to mean exploitation. We have a choice. We can either build a company that treats people like disposable parts, or we can build a company that outlasts all of us because it's rooted in respect. Kristen, the CFO, cleared her throat. But Ethan, with all due respect, we have shareholders to answer to. Profitability has to come first. Ethan stopped pacing. No, it doesn't. The silence was deafening. It's a lie we tell ourselves to justify short-term thinking, Ethan said, his voice softer but no less firm. Companies that treat their employees with dignity don't lose money in the long term. They gain loyalty, innovation, and resilience. Kristen opened her mouth, but Ethan raised a hand to stop her. I know what you're about to say. Yes, labor costs will rise. Yes, profit margins will shrink. At first. But let me ask you this. How much does it cost to replace a trained barista? How much do we lose in productivity every time a store turns over half its staff in a year? No one answered. Employee turnover last year was 64%. Ethan said, his tone cutting. In the top-performing companies in the hospitality sector, it's under 30%. Why? Because those companies invest in their people instead of treating them like liabilities. Greg leaned forward, eyes sharp. That's all very inspiring, Ethan, but inspiration doesn't pay dividends. Ethan's expression didn't change. Neither does a labor lawsuit. The bluntness startled a few board members, but Ethan didn't stop. I've seen what's happening in our stores, he continued. Not from behind a desk, from behind a counter. I've seen managers manipulating schedules to avoid paying overtime. I've seen employees afraid to report harassment. I've seen baristas cry in stockrooms because they can't make rent on their paychecks. Greg's face darkened. That's anecdotal. It's reality, Ethan shot back. And it's not sustainable. Our brand, our reputation, is built on community. On the idea that Grayson Grounds is a place where people want to work and customers want to gather. If the truth gets out, and it always gets out, we're not just looking at labor complaints, we're looking at a brand implosion. He let the words settle like a weight. This isn't about feel-good policies, Ethan said. It's about survival. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Greg sat back again, arms crossed. What's your proposal? Ethan drew a deep breath. We implement the following immediately. Minimum guaranteed hours for all employees working over 90 days. No more last-minute schedule cuts. Mandatory paid breaks. Enforced, not optional. A full audit of all payroll discrepancies for the last 18 months. Every employee reimbursed in full. An anonymous, third-party employee complaint system, so no one fears retaliation. Starting pay raised by 15%, with clear paths to promotion and annual reviews. Kristen shook her head slightly. That's a lot. It's what's necessary, Ethan said. And there's one more thing. Greg's eyebrow lifted. I will personally visit a random store, unannounced, every month. I'll work a full shift, not as a CEO, as a barista. Several board members exchanged glances, uncertain whether to laugh or argue. And Ethan added, I'll publish an open letter after each shift, summarizing what I saw. Good, bad, and everything in between. Full transparency. Greg's lips pressed into a thin line. You think investors are going to like hearing about our dirty laundry? They'll like it a lot more than a class action lawsuit, Ethan said. And if anyone thinks they can pressure me out of this role for doing the right thing, I welcome them to try. A challenge. Direct and unapologetic. Ethan straightened. This isn't just about wages. It's about who we are. Grayson Grounds can either be a company that treats people like humans, or it can be one more forgettable chain that burned itself out chasing quarterly bonuses. I know which one I'm choosing. The room fell silent again. Finally, Greg sighed, rubbing his temple. You're putting a hell of a lot of faith in the goodwill of your employees. No, Ethan said. I'm putting my faith in something stronger. Trust. Months later, the transformation didn't happen overnight. Some managers quit. Others were fired. New ones, many of them promoted from within, stepped into leadership roles with fresh training and clearer expectations. Maya, from store number 47, became a district training leader, helping to rewrite onboarding programs from the ground up. Marcus, the nervous teenage barista who once trained Ethan during his undercover shift, became a shift lead, teaching new hires with patience and humor. The turnover rate dropped by nearly 30% within 6 months. Customer satisfaction scores rose steadily. And though profit margins did tighten at first, productivity gains from better retention gradually offset the costs. Most importantly, the fear that had hung in the air like invisible smoke slowly faded. Employees spoke up, not just to complain, but to suggest improvements, share ideas, and ask questions. The culture Ethan had once dreamed of, the culture he thought had died, was slowly coming back to life. A personal reckoning. One evening, long after the corporate offices had emptied, Ethan stood outside the first-ever Grayson Grounds, the tiny brick-and-mortar shop where it all began. The original wooden sign, slightly weathered but still intact, hung above the door. He stepped inside. The smell of fresh coffee, warm pastries, and faint laughter filled the air. A new generation of baristas worked behind the counter, joking and moving with the effortless rhythm of a team that trusted each other. Ethan ordered a simple black coffee, just like he had on opening day. When the cashier handed it over, she smiled. A real smile, the kind Ethan once thought was extinct. "Welcome to Grayson Grounds," she said. "Let us know if there's anything we can do to make your day better." Ethan smiled back. "You already did.